Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me at the outset to thank the Institute of International Finance on behalf of the Governor of the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency for the invitation to address this distinguished audience at the 2019 IIF Annual Membership Meeting. Some 4 months ago, during the IIF Spring Membership Meeting in Tokyo, my governor presented the global, regional, and domestic backdrop for the Saudi G20 presidency in 2020. At this point in time, 2020 is becoming an immediate prospect. A topic being discussed in a multitude of venues these days here in Washington, D.C. is that the economic challenges which we will be confronted with during the coming year are considerable. They have also not diminished since my governor's address in June, to say the least. The purpose of my presentation today is twofold. First, to draw attention to the economic policy challenges ensuing from the current global outlook, in particular for emerging market economies, and second, to indicate how Saudi Arabia is faring in this environment. So let me start with the weakening global economic growth, which is a sign of old age. Economic projections indicate weakening of the global growth to its lowest level since the global financial crisis, although it is projected to pick up in 2020. The IMF Autumn 2019 World Economic Outlook, released 2 days ago, is the most recent example in this regard. Indeed, it is no longer a blue sky, but increasingly clouds have gathered on the horizon. A clearer point in that direction is the list of downside risks to the outlook and heightened policy uncertainty. It is not just that the list of risk factors have become longer over the past few years. The risks themselves have also intensified in recent times. Trade tensions are probably the first downside risk to the list of many observers, notwithstanding the US-China talks. This risk is going beyond tariffs and non-tariffs barriers. It incorporates issues such as technology transfer and intellectual property rights, uncertainties surrounding the implementation of existing or newly concluded trade agreements, dissatisfaction with the operation of the rule-based multilateral trading system, and disagreement over the way in which the World Trade Organization should be reformed. Other important downside risks have been flagged more or less persistently over the past 2 years. An abrupt shift in risk sentiment, exposing financial vulnerabilities in a variety of countries and sectors of the global financial system. Geopolitical tensions as well, becoming acute in some regions of the world. And this inflationary pressure amplifying in some advanced economies. A further indication of a more cloudy outlook is the gap that has been opened up between manufacturing and investment on the one hand, services and consumption on the other hand. Indeed, in the former categories of economic activities, growth has been deteriorating of the late, whereas in the latter, we see a sustained expansionary path against a backdrop of strong employment numbers. A key question is how this divergent evolution will play out. Will investment and manufacturing pick up again? Or will services start losing steam and consumers become more cautious in their spending behavior, thereby dragging growth even further. Still, another signal of the clouds gathering on the horizon is the continuing series of small downward revisions to the global outlook by the IMF and other international organizations. This chart shows the successive downward revisions to the 2019 growth projections in the IMF's WEU documents since the spring of 2018. Now let me talk about the current economic policy stance in a late cycle environment fully fit for purpose. How well prepared are economic policymakers at the current juncture to deal with a potential downturn? Looking at the monetary policy first, central banks across the globe have adopted more accommodative policies, in particular in the major advanced economies. For as long as inflation objectives are not achieved in a sustainable manner, such a stance is difficult to criticize. Unless one take a view that central banks are unnecessarily wasting their ammunition instead of keeping their powder dry for when the downturn really sets in. Of course, we need to be cognizant of the side effect of what are by now already 10 years of very accommodative monetary policy, which is characterized as lower for longer interest rate environment. However, in the wake of the global financial crisis, the financial system has been significantly reinforced in terms of micro as well as macroprudential frameworks. Therefore, under the assumption that these policy tools are well calibrated and well targeted, and that they will be used in a timely and proper manner by the relevant authorities, one can take some comfort that the potential negative side effects of a very accommodative monetary policy stances can be managed. A bigger challenge for the monetary policy is that it has for too long been the exclusive policy tool used to keep this long economic expansion on track. As Ben Bernanke, Mohamed El-Arian, and others have labeled it a few years ago, monetary policy is the only game in town. I leave it to the panelists in the next session to take up the pattern here and explore this topic further. It goes without saying that monetary policy is still suited to solve real economic problems, such as persistently muted investment levels, sustained low productivity levels, modest wage developments, or demographic aging. These type of economic challenges have to be tackled by means of other policy tools. Fiscal policy is one of those. Only how potent a tool is it, given that it has to address multiple policy objectives, and considering that the so-called fiscal space availability is not ample for many countries. In principle, fiscal space can be created in different ways by reprioritizing expenditure away from other, less important spending categories, by boosting the efficiency of public finances, both on the revenue and the expenditure side, by increasing fiscal receipts through taxes and or other means, and by increasing government borrowing. Every country will face different trade-offs in choosing among these venues. But if there is one characteristic that most countries have in common, it is that the public debt levels are high and still rising. I show you a chart from last year IMF Fiscal Monitor on the long-term evolution of a general government debt. Admittedly, there are those who argue that now is the time for government to borrow more at near zero rates in order to invest in productive capacity that will pay off these financial liabilities in the future. In fact, about 1/4 of the global bonds have negative yields, and more than 20% of advanced economies' government bonds are expected to have a negative yields for at least 3 more years. The fact of the matter is that most countries have thus far preferred to keep their fiscal powder dry for a genuine macroeconomic downturn. But we are seeing some recent signs of fiscal relaxation. The positive impact that structural policies can have on economic growth is clearly illustrated for the case of emerging market and developing countries in Chapter 3 of the just released IMF World Economic Outlook. In addition to their direct impact, structural policies also indirectly influence economic growth by affecting an economy's resilience. In 2016, the G20 launched an enhanced structural reform agenda. 9 areas were identified as priorities, including promoting trade and investment openness, advancing labor market reforms, educational and attainment and skills, and improving infrastructure. The OECD is tasked to provide its assessment of the progress made in these domains. Its findings show that there remains a lot of work to do. The following chart from the OECD annual Going for Growth publication of last July neatly sums up its assessment. Limited short-term results and waning global support are often pointed to as the culprits for the poor outcomes. It is therefore legitimate to ask whether the global economy that is running predominantly on one policy cylinder, the monetary one, is sufficiently well targeted for dealing with a situation in which the clouds on the horizon would turn out to be the harbinger of a serious storm. It is an open question that every country's policymaker will need to answer for her or himself. It's important to underline also the potentially positive impact of an effective interplay between the various policy domains. A couple of years ago, IMF staff was advocating the need for a CCC policy stance at the international level: comprehensive, consistent, and coordinated. Comprehensive because covering all policy areas, consistent because working in a time-consistent manner, coordinated because operating in a mutually beneficial and reinforcing model. I would venture to say that applying such a stance at the domestic level can act as a booster to domestic growth and therefore, in the aggregate, also to the global growth. Let me touch upon the sustaining the development agenda in emerging market economies in the face of a less benign environment. Needless to say that the state of the global economy represents an increasingly challenging external environment for emerging market economies. Sure, the accommodative monetary policy conditions in major advanced economies are driving more capital in the direction of the emerging world in their quest for a better yield. But lessons have been learned regarding the unsustainable nature of some of these flows, as well as about the difficulties faced in absorbing large inflows and the side effect they can generate. A quartet of policy recommendation is usually advocated to a typical emerging market economy to better cope with large capital inflows. First, as regards monetary and exchange rate policy, reinforcing the monetary policy credibility of the central bank and applying a judicious mix of exchange rate flexibility and timely interventions. Second, building the resilience of a banking sector and thereby that of the domestic financial market more generally. Third, deepening the domestic capital markets as a structural element of a financial policy to create over time a more diversified and hence more stable financial environment. Fourth, putting in place and applying an effective macroprudential toolkit to both bank and non-bank financial sectors. Building a strong financial market infrastructure and conducting policies that maintain financial stability and enable a sound financing of the economy is, however, only one leg of the three-legged stool to foster economic growth. The other two legs that needs to be in place are, first, the maintenance of a stability-oriented macroeconomic policy environment, and the second, the pursuit of a growth-oriented structural policy agenda. Putting all these requirements into practice, however, is a hard act to follow for a typical emerging and developing economy in the face of its many economic development challenges. Now let me turn to the Saudi economy. How is Saudi Arabia coping up with the challenges posed by the evolving global economic nature and the potential constraints on specific policy tools? The prime transmission channel through which changes in the world economic outlook affect our domestic economy is evidently the oil price and production. Although oil GDP only has a share of some 40% in our total GDP nowadays, oil revenues still represent about 2/3 of the central government revenues and around 3/4 of our export revenues. This chart is, among other things, showing oil and non-oil GDP growth over the last 4 years. I draw your attention also to the contribution of the non-oil revenue growth in the fiscal numbers. Needless to say that fluctuations in oil price and the quantities of exported oil have important first side round effect on the Saudi Arabian economic data. With oil prices expected to be more than 10% lower in 2019 than in the previous year, and considering Saudi Arabia's contribution to the reduction in oil supplies agreed between OPEC and some other countries, it should come as a little surprise that our oil GDP growth is projected to be negative this year. The attack on our oil production facilities last month has almost no explanatory power here. The final 2019 GDP figure of my country will ultimately be determined almost as much by the resilience of our non-oil GDP sector. The OECD is more optimistic here than for instance, the IMF or ourselves for that matter. To come back for a moment to my more general point about the influence of a changing world economic outlook on the oil prices, I put up this chart showing showing on the one hand the evolution of economic policy uncertainty, and on the other hand the price of oil. Obviously, the price of oil is influenced by many demand and supply factors. But it is interesting to note that during the past 2 years, rising levels of economic policy uncertainty have tended to correlate with declining oil prices. So this kind of correlation is in immediate aftermath, but the rising global uncertainty could be expected to negatively influence global growth. This is the reason. The negative correlation is not very strong, but it is persistent and therefore more than just a daily phenomenon, as we have seen on a number of occasions during the past 2 years. More generally, changing expectation about the risk of the global outlook are an important driver of the overall risk-on, risk-off switching behavior, which we often witnessed and which is influenced other important variables. It affects among amount of safe haven flows, for instance, flowing into the U.S. Treasury paper. Conversely, it influences one of the so-called push factors of capital flows to emerging market economies. In addition, it is having an effect on the exchange rate of the US dollar for a domestic currency of a number of emerging market economies. Consequently, it requires these countries to make short-term adjustment in their monetary, exchange rate, and prudential policy stance. Saudi Arabia has, up until now, been much less influenced by such developments because of the specific situation it is in, due to the combination of oil being priced in the US dollar and the weight of oil in our external trade because of our exchange rate regime, which is big between the US dollar and the Saudi riyal. We are, however, not facing this kind of difficulty in terms of monetary and exchange rate policies trade-offs that other countries may encounter. In addition, because of our prudential policy stance, our large external buffers, reserve buffers, and above all, the credibility of our policy setting, our exposure to capital inflows and outflows is much less challenging than in the case of other emerging market economies. In terms of the fiscal policy, we are also in a very different situation from the average emerging market economies in that we have low public debt levels, strong fiscal buffers, and a commitment to balance the budget over the medium term. Of course, in a scenario of much lower GDP growth, the numbers could become less favorable, but still very viable for many other countries. To reduce the sensitivity of the Saudi economy to oil, our Vision 2030 strategy was launched some 3 years ago. It aims to exploit our country's strength and capabilities in many other areas outside the oil sector. From a purely economic perspective, which is in narrowing down the concept underlying the Vision 2030, most of the 13 vision realization programs that have been elaborated and are being implemented imply a very ambitious agenda of the structural reform for the Saudi economy. This is notably the case for the Financial Sector Development Program, the Human Capital Development Program, the Privatization Program, the National Companies Promotion Program, the Housing Program, the National Industrial Development and Logistics Program, and the National Transformation Plan Program. As, excuse me, as with all structural policy initiative, execution is the crux of the matter. This will require strong and sustained action. For that purpose, the Saudi authority have devised a clear accountability mechanism to follow up on the implementation of various programs and direct and indirect goal linked to them. Now is still too early to take stock in an encompassing manner of the results obtained in terms of diversification, but important steps have been taken already in areas such as the labor market, the financial sector, and the services sector, including, for instance, tourism. Let me share with you some of the assessments that the OECD have made on Saudi Arabia's structural reform efforts in the context of its monitoring of the G20 enhanced structural reform agenda to which I referred earlier. This assessment will be presented to the G20 finance minister and central bank governors later today. As you can see from this chart, Saudi Arabia's employment ratio has been rising steadily. Inequality as measured by the Gini coefficients have decreased significantly from the 2007 and is now close to the median of G20 emerging economies. Administrative barriers to starting a business, as measured by the World Bank's Doing Business indicator, have significantly improved since 2007 and are now approaching the average of G20 emerging economies. Important incentives have been introduced by the Saudi government to foster the development of the SME, enhanced FDI attraction, and deepen financial markets. Foreign investment restrictions were lifted in 2018 in recruitment, real estate brokerage, media services, commission agents, and land transport services. The adoption of a bankruptcy law in 2018 and the implementation of the new competition law should help improve the competitive environment and encourage investments. The MDI World Competitiveness Ranking, released in May, as well as the WAF Global Competitiveness Ranking, released last week, illustrate the improvements Saudi Arabia is making. With time lacking to go further into details, I just want to underscore that the journey continues towards achieving our ambition, and that the Saudi authorities, including we in SAMA, will do their utmost to contribute to a successful achievement of the targets set. We know there is alternatives, but we know that there are no alternative but to persevere with our wide-ranging agenda of structural reforms, even if we were to face a less benign external environment. Let me conclude with some observation on the IIF and the G20 policy agenda. I have referred only marginally to the financial sector issues in my talk today, which is a core topic of the G20 agenda and of a prime interest to a body such as the IIF, as well as the economy of Saudi Arabia. Since my governor spoke at some length about this in June, I suffices for me to stress one message. Harnessing technological progress, including in the financial sector, to bring more financial value added, better opportunities for financing the growth of the real economy, and the greater financial inclusion and hence economic opportunities for all is a very strong policy priority for Saudi authorities. To deliver on this priority, we are open to advice from various angles, including from the business communities and the financial sector groupings such as the IIF. Our upcoming G20 presidency will create additional opportunities in this regard. Based on the solid track record of the IIF, its research findings and advocacy on the financial sector issues, including in the field of financial technology, we are also looking forward to a continuation of our fruitful dialogue with the IIF. I thank you for your attention.